All right. So thank you everyone for joining us for our third installment today in the Access to Experts part of our winter intersession Career Development Academy. Today we're going to be joined by Palani and Tyler to talk a lot about how you can leverage your Bloomberg Practicum into your job search. So knowing that the experiences that you can get as a student as part of those practicum opportunities can really be useful and helpful to build the necessary steps looking for your job search going forward. So with that, we'll get right into it. We'll ask both Palani and Tyler to introduce themselves. So I'll start with Palani, please.
Thanks, Paul, for having me today.
Sure.
And hi, everyone. So I am Palani Mui. I am the Associate Director of the Office of Public Health Practice and Training at the School of Public Health, and also many students know me as the MPH Practicum Coordinator as well. And so I work a lot with the MPH students around how to think about how to approach their practicums, how to identify them, and then I also coordinate all of that associated with that. But then also more broadly, as part of the practice office, I work to really identify and engage various practice opportunities that students can really identify and kind of work with to be able to build out their experiences and then also be able to strengthen their resumes too as they're starting to look for jobs after graduation.
And Tyler?
Hey, everybody. Great to be here today with you. My name is Tyler Dareth. I am the Associate Director of SOURCE, which is the Community Engagement and Service Learning Center for the East Baltimore campus that's serving the schools of public health, nursing, and medicine. And our office works with over 100 nonprofits in Baltimore City. We develop a lot of partnerships for students that looks like engaging in the curriculum of service learning courses, doing a number of our premier programs that run from a couple of days to all year long. But one of our highlights is being able to tie in many of our programs to practicum hours for students. And so we facilitate a lot of practicum experiences with organizations across the city.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you again, both of you, for being here today. I think it hopefully will be a useful conversation for our students. So let's get right into some of the questions here. So one of the first questions I want to give and to share with you is if you can share the ways that you've seen students in the past use or turn their public health experiences into jobs after graduation, knowing that there's sometimes a connection between an experience or something that's good. So any experiences or the things you can share that you know that students have been successful with practicum experiences this way. And Palani, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think as a whole, with regards to practicums, I've definitely seen students continue to work with the same organization after graduating, whether that be building on the work that they already started or in a completely different role. So that's definitely something that we've seen come across, as well as just students who will typically use the practicum as a way to help inform their job search. So thinking about it as a way to really demonstrate to employers, here I have practical experience in this given area, here are some tangible outputs that I've worked on. And it's a good way to start that conversation around how have you actually applied what you've learned in your program into practice, and what tangible experience do you have that could also potentially help show that you're a good fit for the organization with which you're looking to work. And then one thing I do want to note too is we also have some students who have continued to maintain connections with their preceptors and the people that they work with at that organization after graduating. So not just right after they graduate, but years down the line. And we've seen some students that have gone back to work with those organizations a couple of years later. So it might not necessarily be right after you graduate, but kind of maintaining those relationships is key.
I'll just build on to that a little bit and reaffirm what Palani is saying. There's plenty of students who, when they're working with some kind of organization, continuing on after they've graduated and being able to take on a full-time position there. Something that we often see, because we're dealing with organizational networks or community-based organizations, is folks who work with an organization, head off somewhere, and then return to that place a few years later because they've kept connections open, or get to know people at other organizations or in other offices while they're working in their practicum, and then moving off to those other organizations that they got to know and meet during that experience. So, for example, we've had folks work with a community-based organization on immigrant and migrant issues, refugee issues that needed to talk with the mayor's office. And when they graduated, got a role and a position in the mayor's office for migrant affairs. And similarly, the folks sort of translate across organizations that are working for the same community, or organizations that are national, that have offices here in Baltimore, as well as in other cities if they want to move closer to home, or they've got connections in their own hometowns, being able to translate that across the national organization.
And I guess to kind of add to that too, is it often that students are looking at the practicum first as just the way you gain experience and not thinking about the job next, or is it that they're thinking about this, and I guess that kind of leads to my next question, is that kind of strategic part of what it is that they have to do, that it oftentimes is just like, oh, this is a graduation requirement, I got to get this done. But is there any kind of thinking about how this can kind of fit into the building blocks of what they might want to do in a public health career?
I think it really depends on the student. And I mean, I think to your point, I think we also encourage students from our office standpoint to really not view the practicum as just another checkbox for graduation, because it really is a way for them to be able to gain valuable applied experience. And that can be used not only to strengthen their resume and also build experience in their areas of interest, but also as a chance to kind of explore new areas too. Like if, for example, you have someone who's coming into the program and exploring a specific area in public health that they don't necessarily have experience in, it could be a good way to kind of test that out, see what it's like. And that could also influence their job search down the line. I would say not everyone thinks about the job when they're looking for practicums. I think especially as you're in the program, it's really thinking about the practicum as a way to build experience, and then use that later on, depending on how your experience went, to be like, do I want to find a job in that area? Do I want to build on that? Or maybe you might come out of it being like, this was a really great learning experience, but I think now I'm going to shift my direction a little bit with my job search, which is also fine. And so one of the courses that I co-teach is actually a Tools of Public Health Practice course. And we actually have students do a self-assessment in that course about what are their short and long-term goals and how they envision kind of planning out their program. And that's inclusive of their practicum, their capstone or thesis, research assistantships, volunteer opportunities, service opportunities, all the things that they really engage in during their programs. But how do they plan that all out to get them to their professional goals? And so my recommendation is really think strategically in terms of keeping the bigger picture in mind, in terms of what their goals are, where they're trying to go. And then also keeping in mind that things might shift based on what you engage in. And so knowing that you might need to go back and reassess and revamp your goals and the direction that you want to take, and that's fine too.
Yeah, I think I treat it, as practice, and really like practicing the profession. And I want to make a distinction maybe between a job and the professions in public health. And getting to test out what it means to be a professional in this kind of environment without needing to pinpoint exactly what a job or particular career is going to look like. To Palani's point, that stuff changes and is likely to change for quite a while. That can be a whole career of adjusting where you feel like you need to be in that moment. But the experiences that you're gaining and trying to think strategically about how to use a practicum, I think is a way of experiencing and practicing what it means to be a professional in this kind of environment, no matter the kind of job that the practicum may sort of lean towards or not, and whether you think it fits for you specifically. The learning experience that comes out of that, if you're committed to it not just being a checkbox, but something that you're investing in, is going to be valuable for giving you direction in your career. And the kind of jobs that you want to be looking for, even if the practicum doesn't align specifically with the job that you want to be doing.
And I guess Tyler, kind of what you're saying with that is too, it's like this is a chance to, if you don't have any real work experience, that a practicum can give you a sense of what it's like to work within an organization and to work with professionals as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times folks frame practicum around the public health content that they want to be working on. Absolutely an important consideration. The other thing that is going to land almost on any practicum is the experience of just being in that kind of space, needing to work with other people, needing to manage, calendars and schedules and timing, and having that interpersonal and social element that's really important to being a public health professional.
Yeah. And Plani, do you see that too in students you talk to about it, that they gain that same insight?
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely something that's very common among the students that I work with.
And is there any way that they have, I guess, recognize that in this kind of, I guess, safe environment or practicum, that they can take that skill and use it, or is it just more something that they kind of realize after the fact?
I think it varies. So I've seen it go both ways. And I don't know if Tyler, you've seen this kind of the same way too, but I think it really varies on the experience that the student has and also kind of the expectations that the student has going in as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, use the word safe environment. I might instead say something like a bounded or limited environment. You're dealing with real people and real jobs and real communities. A lot of times when it's connected with our work, it's not necessarily safe, right? There are stakes and responsibilities here, but you get tons of support. It's in a bounded way that's telling you the specific objectives that you're trying to accomplish within a certain time frame. All really important limitations so that you can focus in the moment on trying to gain the experiences of what it means to engage with community members, what it means to engage with other professionals and colleagues, and take time to learn from that. A lot of times what we try and set up at Source is a system for being able to ask questions of yourself and do some reflections with the folks around you, with your practicum advisor, so that you can process what's happening before it's already gone.
Perfect. So we may have kind of touched on this a little bit already, but so I often think of, when talking to students about gaining experience, or a challenge that they feel like that they have, is when they look at a job or they look at a position to go into, they'll just be like, well, I don't have any experience. They're looking for 2 to 3 years of experience. And so what I try to get them to think about a lot of times is, well, think about everything that you've been doing. Think about these different activities that you've done, and that they can fill in the gap. And so just to get your impressions of that, in terms of, how much experience do you think that you need to have? And then, is the practicum a good kind of way to fill in the gap, even if it's, something that, like you think, is time bound?
I can start with that. I mean, I think with regards to the practicum, I think it can definitely be a way to kind of fill in the gap that you're talking about in terms of how you think about it and how you approach it, especially because I think taking a step back, so like looking at this in terms of when students first look for a practicum, we have them think about how do they want to approach that particular experience. Is it a way to build kind of practical experience where they're applying specific skills and knowledge from their coursework into practice to gain that kind of tangible, practical firsthand experience that's different when an employer is looking at a resume from like, hey, I've taken coursework in this area versus, hey, I've done an internship looking at X, Y, and Z, and here are tangible outputs that reflect my contributions to that. But I also see students who use it as a way to kind of test out what it's like to work in a specific sector or with a particular organization. The practicum, especially for someone who is maybe trying to pivot, whether that be into public health or using that to kind of transition into another thing. I think one of the things we really talk about with students is thinking about what are those transferable skills that they are getting from their experiences that they can then use in a conversation with an employer and be able to share more about the work that they're doing and how that fits with what that employer is looking for, depending on what sort of experience they're looking for that student to have.
Yeah, I think it can act as a nice kind of lead in, or you have fill in the gap here, but it's a sort of transitional experience or concrete example of things that you are learning about and already doing, maybe already have experience in. I'm a public health transplant, right? I'm trained as an education researcher. I do a lot of schoolwork, and coming into public health spaces, having some experience with community organizations that do public health work. The thing that helps for me, and that sometimes I guide students who haven't had a lot of public health experience, is to take the practicum or take the experience that you're having at that moment and be aware of the skills that you already have that you're implementing in a public health space. If I'm doing education and schoolwork, there's tons of social determinants that are happening in that kind of environment where I'm working with students to try to process the ways they're achieving in a certain class, let's say. Being able to translate that into public health language, stuff that I'm already doing and have been doing for a long time, even though my resume doesn't say I have public health experience, is a nice concrete way to say, for example, when I did it with this organization, this is what happened. And I've been doing this kind of work for years when I try to think about the ways that communities impact people or environments impact people. And then you can sort of draw that through line of maybe you've not been public health, but it doesn't mean that you don't have any skills to contribute. This makes it a really concrete way to be able to tie those skills into a public health space.
Yeah, Tyler, I think you did a very good job kind of leading into the next kind of question with this is, how do students kind of blend in their training into a practicum or to a job search? So oftentimes finding when talking to students is they have an interest in wanting to go into something, but they don't have the experience to do it. But it turns out that, that they do have ways to demonstrate that they have that. So I kind of think what you say there is very much in line with this, is that, giving that kind of, for example, I've done it here along with some of these other things in the past that are similar to it. It's just identifying the common thread that you have with doing that type of work and learning to apply it in a different way and then using the public health language along with it as well. I guess with this kind of thought too about especially too about the public health training and the courses, and maybe Plani talk a little bit more about this in terms of the public health competencies and like how, things you learn in certain classes can be used. Is there a way that you help students to kind of see like, oh, this class really means that you can kind of do this or anything like that?
It's a good question. I would say that's more outside of my purview in terms of helping them with specific courses. I would say coursework kind of curriculum advice typically comes to students through either their academic network advisors or through talking with the MPH office, or with, if they're from a different program, with whoever their program coordinator is. But in terms of kind of linking that back to practicum, for instance, I definitely do have students who come to me saying, hey, I'm interested in X, Y, and Z kind of competencies and specific skill sets. How do I perhaps try to kind of frame a practicum or identify a practicum that helps me to kind of get to that point where I can actually address some of those?
Great.
And that courses are qualified as practicum sometimes. And so being able to fit that into the curriculum so that you get that additional content support while you're doing that kind of practice is one way of trying to pull those together very clearly. We have our service learning courses that are often designated as practicum, but then there are other courses that are just practicum that, Kalani certainly knows all about.
Yeah.
And I think building on that too, just really quick, is just that those courses actually, not just thinking about them as service learning or practicum courses per se, but as opportunities to really gain practical experience, applying some of those skills into practice from those courses. And so not just taking them to meet a requirement, but even if you're just interested in that topic area and you want to be able to demonstrate tangible outputs having worked with an organization, those could be a great way to do so. And so we always encourage students to look at those classes if they're interested. I'm sure we could share a link to the page that has those listed, but really being able to see those as opportunities to gain practical experience and help them in their job search, or even just in their personal and professional development as well.
Great. So I'm interested to kind of talk. So looking at the job search and the practicum search as kind of dual things that are happening maybe at the same time or one's happening before the other one. But I guess in terms of the strategies for doing the search, so we've talked a lot this week about, looking at the job search, kind of reframing the job search as one that is really focused on not looking for job titles, but looking for places and looking for people, doing the networking, the information interviewing, making yourself known and putting yourself on the radar of people that you're interested in. Would you say that those same strategies could be the same strategies to use when considering any type of practicum experience?
Yeah, I definitely think they apply to both. I would also say typically what we see is it kind of goes the opposite way, where students will do the practicum search first and then end up applying those towards their search for a job later, just the nature of how that fits into their program. But I think as a whole, all of the things that you mentioned definitely apply, regardless of whether that's for a practicum, whether that's for a job. And I mean, one of the recommendations we always give to students is really to treat the practicum like they would a job. And so in that sense, yes, they definitely are similar strategies to approaching both.
I think we try and offer support and being able to build in and let students take advantage of the built-in network that we have with our organizations, so that it's a little bit easier to break into, and we can send a first email and say, hey, I think there's some synergy here. Let's talk about whether there's a project possibility or not. And even if there's not, it's a good connection to be making, to the point of using similar strategies to the job search. Even if you don't get a job from every person you talk to, it doesn't mean that it's a wasted opportunity. It's another good person in the field to be talking to who's doing a lot of work. And I think, I'm the community guy, so I'm going to talk about community as much as I can, but being able to build up communities in that way and realize that relationships and people are not one-dimensional, but that there's a lot to gain, whether you get, some concrete project or practicum or job at the end of it. It's really good to be building those deep relationships either way.
Yeah. And I kind of think about the idea of a place like Source, which has a reputation within the community, has built these partnerships over years, and really leveraging that connection as well to say like, how can I use the collective strength of not only Hopkins and Bloomberg, but also Source, of the practicum office, of everything, just to kind of like make it a little bit easier so that students don't feel like they have to do it on their own, or they're just kind of flying blind with this. Is like, there are places there that can, do an influential introduction or do something like that. And like you say, like, student says, I'm interested in this. Well, maybe we have a community-based organization over here that has done something like this in the past, and then we can reach out to them and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I guess I wonder about too, so when the idea that oftentimes there's not obstacles, but I guess pitfalls that students kind of go through in doing their job or doing a practicum search, are there any things that, students should try to avoid doing when kind of doing this search? Or, things that you have seen that have not worked well for students in the past?
I think I have three main things that I would share for this one. I think one is for students to really have a sense of direction as to kind of what they want from their practicum experience, but then also keeping an open mind when searching. So as an example, sometimes we have students who might have multiple interests that span several areas that don't necessarily overlap all that well. And so limiting the practicum search just to opportunities that check all of the boxes might not necessarily be the best approach, because there might not be something out there that fits everything per se in a perfect kind of square. And so on the other side, though, they might be able to find something that really might allow them to focus in on one of their interests and gain really valuable experience working in that area. And they can then supplement and build on that in other interest areas through coursework, through other engagement opportunities, through a capstone or a thesis. And so in that way, they're still able to hit on all the different things that they're interested in, just not necessarily just through one thing only. And I think to that, building onto my second point, which is we often have students who will just look at Hopkins specific resources when searching. And I think something to think about is broadening that search, because there's so many things out there to be able to look for that. And we don't always hear about all the opportunities from organizations, especially if they're recruiting from a wide range of applicants and they aren't necessarily seeking out a Hopkins student specifically. And so being able to broaden that search, to be able to open as many doors as possible. And I think to that point, not being afraid to network. So I think it's something that I think students have always come to me with kind of a feeling that it is challenging to know how to network, especially if it's not something that they have experience in doing. But being able to talk to different people, whether that be faculty, organizations, alumni, can really open new doors and give them valuable insights, like in terms of what's out there, whether or not that leads to a practicum. And then it allows them to really think through, okay, what is it that I want to get out of this experience based on all the insights that they're getting from the people that they talk to.
Yeah, I'll add that.
Yeah.
I'll add that I encourage students to think of this as an entry into a partnership, no matter what they're working on or who they're working with. I think one of the things that I sometimes have to back students down from a little bit is coming to us with a fully formed idea and saying, I need somewhere to do this, or I need an organization who's willing to take on this idea or project, which of course isn't a partnership as much as just looking for a site for the thing that you want to do. And as any good public health professional knows, trying to implement something in the community without any kind of communal partnership is not going to be sustainable. And I think that's the same sort of truth for a person in their career, and certainly the person trying to do a practicum is you're entering into an ecosystem. And being a part of that and understanding that you have some influence to change that ecosystem, but not take it over, is really an important thing. So I'll just highlight Palani's point about coming with your own interests and goals, but always remaining flexible in that, because we don't know everything, and we don't have the fully formed idea or best idea, and being open to having that revised or added onto or grown from is a really important element.
And I guess for the both of you, in terms of like the practicum opportunities that are available for students, are they the same from year to year, or do they change from semester to semester? So I'm just curious to know that in terms of the opportunities, kind of what they look like.
So at least on my end, and Tyler can speak to more on the end of Source and the CBOs that they partner with, but from our side, we definitely see a wide range of projects each year. Sometimes we'll see similar projects that'll come through, but I think it also gets to Tyler's point about it really depends on what an organization's needs and priorities are at a given time. And that shifts depending on their funding, depending on their work that they're currently working on, or things that come across their plate. And so it's really about kind of figuring out what that is in terms of working with the organization, rather than trying to be like, here, I have a already formed project that I'm coming to you with, but rather going at it in terms of like talking to the organization, seeing what their needs are, and how a student can then help them. It's ultimately meant to be a mutually beneficial experience. And so the whole key point around partnership is really something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Palani. The only caveat I'll add is there's a general sense of planning that can be done. If you think about some of our premier programs where there's a shape to it, even if you don't know what the project will be. I'm thinking of our service scholars program, for example, that says, hey, you're going to work at least 150 hours over August to April, and you need to do these 6 things. But we don't know what the project will be until the organization lets us know. The other example, of course, is the service learning courses or the practicum-based courses that we just wrapped in the second term, the food systems class. So we know it's going to have a project to do with food systems, but that's going to change every single year, because sometimes the partners change, or if the partners are coming back, they're on to the next phase of their work. And so it's always going to be responsive to community goals at that point.
And I guess too, that also too kind of, kind of speaks to like what sometimes the job search is that there might not be the fully formed idea of what a role is going to be at the time that you're looking. And a lot of times organizations are creating these positions as they're needed. There maybe sometimes is a consistency of what they need to have, but I think for a lot of organizations, they don't know kind of ahead of time what they're going to have and what they're going to be hiring for. So it's also it's a good idea to then think about the building the relationship. So if something does form, something does become developed, or something new does happen, that you're kept in mind for that. So I think it's good to kind of hear that it happens in kind of both spaces as well.
Yeah, sometimes a practicum is the proving ground to show that a job really needs to be in this place where
that's a good point. That's a really good
had
point.
a student for 2 months.
Yeah. And that's a lot of times too, when I talk to students about like, when they're doing an internship, is they almost kind of treat it as if it's a 3-month job interview, because you could really prove and make a case for why someone should be in this role. And the hope would be it would be you, and then you're the only candidate that's considered for that particular role. So it's good to kind of have that idea of like, if I do this really, really well, I might be able to prove that it's worthwhile to keep me here as well. All right. So I want to make sure that, we have anybody that has questions, feel free to put something into the chat. Feel free to raise your hand or take yourself off mute. We have, I have a few more questions for Tyler and Palani, but I want to make sure that anybody here might have a question about something that was shared, didn't make sense or anything like that. So, just feel free to kind of jump in at any point.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me? Yes, great.
Yep.
So I'm interested in global health, and I haven't quite narrowed down specific area. I'm thinking children and women's health. I have had an interview, not an interview, but an informational session with someone at Save the Children. And she did suggest that I send a resume, and I think that she will be, a great contact. We didn't talk specifically about a practicum, but you were saying if you have something to offer an organization that could be mutually beneficial. So what would that look like?
So I think it depends on also what that organization is looking for at this point as well. So like getting a sense for what exactly it is that their current projects and priorities and needs are, and then thinking about what skills you're bringing to the table that might marry into those needs that they have, and then having more of that iterative conversation with the organization to see, are there any opportunities for students to engage in the work that they're currently doing. Being able to plug into something that they're already doing is typically a lot simpler than trying to come to them and be like, hey, let's develop a new project from scratch. It's also then less of an ask for the organization too, to be able to support that, given that it is work that they already know is something that they need to do and get done. And so that could at least be a starting point for some of those conversations.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I have, excuse me, and I guess it kind of ties in a little bit what was asked there. Is just kind of say, if students are connecting with employers or connecting with CBOs, or they are looking for practicum opportunities, or maybe trying to explore what it could be, what should be some of the things that are kind of kept in mind? And the idea too that when they're doing this, they are representing the school, they are representing Bloomberg, and just kind of what should be kind of top of mind when they're thinking about it.
I think graduate school is an interesting place because you're specifically and primarily here to learn things, but it is also a relatively professional environment. And you're specifically learning about how to be a professional in a certain kind of space. And when you're doing that in thinking about your practicum, it's even more that way. Certainly it's a learning opportunity, but it's a professional learning opportunity. So to your point, Paul, I think when you are understanding the position that you're holding, one is to think about it as if you are, because you are, in fact, a professional. But this is an opportunity to engage with a colleague of some kind. It might be a more senior colleague, but it's still that sort of mentality that you can approach it with. Alongside that, and this might connect to, I think it was Carol who was asking the question, Carolyn, excuse me, who was asking the question earlier, that you can approach this with a kind of learning humility and sort of saying, like, I'm trying to learn and understand the field a little bit better. I'm very interested in the work that you're doing. Can you tell me more about it? Knowing that you still have something to contribute potentially, and have those things ready to go so that you can make those, authentic and organic kind of connections to say, to offer ideas and solutions. I think I could see this working here. Is there any way to make space so that we could do this together in some capacity? Is a way to sort of enter into that kind of conversation. I will always sort of put on the maybe the front of folks' minds is we often work with community organizations here in the city that are living on a shoestring budget, that are working with marginalized communities. And when we say we're coming from Hopkins, that means something very particular. And it doesn't mean something that's perfectly good all the time. And being aware of that position is a really, really important thing. And I talked about learning humility, but it's also a positional and professional humility to acknowledge the rift in relationships between Hopkins and our city, and signal that you're aware of that you're not trying to perpetuate that, but that there's a lot of healing that can take place in these kind of relationships, and that you are taking some responsibility for engaging in that kind of healing. We do a lot of work here at Source to equip students with the capacity and language to be able to have that kind of conversation. If you're interested in doing that kind of work in the city, and certainly with our partners and organizations. But those kinds of things, right? The social dynamics and power dynamics at play, the professional dynamics at play, and then the learning opportunities, and trying to find intersection between all of those, I think is a great way of beginning conversations with people when you're trying to make those connections.
I agree with everything that Tyler just shared. I think the only other thing I would add too is don't go into it expecting that an organization knows what a practicum is. Some organizations have never heard of what a practicum is, but if you frame it more as a graduate level internship that not only fulfills an academic requirement, but also yields those practice-based products that are developed for the organization's use and benefit, most organizations will be able to relate to that and be able to understand what it is that you're looking for, versus if you're just like, hey, I want a practicum. And so that can also help in your conversation with them as well.
Yeah, I think all those are really good points. I really, that I guess I take for granted the fact that I've been at Hopkins for a long time, and I know with the school and the kind of what's there, but not every student that's coming here for the first time is aware of the history that's kind of there and stuff like that. But that's always an important thing to kind of keep in mind. All right, so I do have another question before I get to our final one, and again, please feel free to put things here into the chat. But I guess I would say is like, what should the student kind of do if they realize that a practicum is beneficial? There's someone that should be making aware of this, or it didn't quite go as planned, or maybe to kind of think, well, a practicum didn't quite meet the expectations that I thought it was going to be, or what I was going to get. So is there, I guess, an avenue for students to kind of share that feedback and kind of get lessons learned going forward?
So I'll go first, Tyler, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
So for the practicum, we do have a means for students to provide feedback. And so they do have an evaluation component. And they will reflect on lessons learned, as well as any of the things that they came across in terms of whether or not they were able to meet their competencies and learning objectives and all of those different pieces. I think something to keep in mind, though, is like if, for example, a student is in the middle of a practicum and things aren't quite working out or they run into issues, we always ask that they contact us as soon as possible, just so that we're aware we're not the ones on the ground working with that organization. And so we don't always know that there is an issue unless that's communicated to us. We have people here who are willing to support and work with the student to try to figure out how to resolve that. But unless we know, we can't really do that. And I think also just knowing who to contact as well. So like for those who are working with Source on any of their Source supported practicums, Source needs to be made aware of those issues first, because first and foremost, those are Source's CBO partners. And so they'll then likely communicate with our office as well, but it would need to go through Source first for those.
Yeah, I think, I'm thinking about all sorts of different kinds of ways that it might not work out or be fulfilling the way that you thought. There's the sort of unexciting, oh, this just wasn't a fulfilling learning experience for me kind of thing. And that's one problem to have. And I suggest that you talk with, trusted academic advisors and mentors, and even bring that up with your organization that you're working with or the partners that you're working with. Talk about what that might look like if you feel like you're equipped to have that kind of conversation. And I think there are plenty of formal and informal avenues to deal with that. A more serious one might be this kind of, oh no, I'm in trouble and I don't know what to do here, which is a different kind of unfulfilling kind of experience, or not what you expected. That's when we got to implement more of those formal type of things. And we have things in place for that. If you're working with us, you talk to us and we talk to the organization, and maybe it's that, they've fallen off the map and you can't get contact, or vice versa. They might come to us and we have a conversation with you all and say like, yeah, you know what, this isn't working out the way that it's supposed to. Let's do some work on this, conflict management space. But every practicum and every person who has a practicum advisor we need to be checking in with and talking to, and there's some institutional link, right? Even if it's Kalani's office and being able to engage with that you can lean on and talk to and say, hey, I have no idea what to do for this next step. What am I supposed to do? There are these, checkpoints where that's already happening. But if you find yourself in between those checkpoints, it doesn't mean that you can't say something. That's what the point of this practicum, right? Is that you're institutionally supported when you need it. We try to make that as available as possible. Certainly when there are institutional connections like Source, and other centers have their institutional and organizational partners. So you can go through those centers to have that conversation. If it's independent, I always send an email to Kalani and she's always been helpful. So I always recommend that to everyone else also.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to the idea that there are these kind of built-in, I want to call them like safety nets, but ways to make sure that things don't go off the rails. But when you start your first job, you're not going to always have that support. You're not always going to have a Kalani or a Tyler or Source or somebody that you can reach out to say, hey, this isn't working out. Can't we fix it? But that's why I think it's an important thing to think about, that these practicums, if they are steering in the wrong direction, you're able to nudge them or pivot them back to what it is that you would want to have, without having to, if you're in a job, having to just change jobs or find somewhere else to work or something like that. So, all right. So getting towards the end, I just want to have one final question. And then again, if anybody has questions in the chat or want to raise your hand. So do you have any final tips or like kind of, important recommendations that you would have for students, either, in all of this, whether it's the practicum, the job search, any parts of it? So whoever would like to start first.
I do. Yeah, right. I'll try and jump in here. This is the question where we're supposed to be really profound, so I'll do my very best. I try to talk about a difference between in public health spaces, but really in learning environments in particular, a difference between learning content and learning ways of doing things. And I think a lot of times content is the easiest thing. Like, what do you study? What do you want to do? Find a practicum that does that stuff. Whether it's, working with youth or working with a specific population, working on drug use or whatever it might be. Versus how do you take whatever that subject area is and think about all of the activity that's involved with that. And that's the practicum especially, I think, is a really robust space where you get to just do a lot of different things, a lot of different activities. You have to have conversations, you have to engage with folks, you have to think about contexts and organizational structures and fit that all into some kind of practice or policy or program or an evaluation or whatever it ends up being. It's a ton of skills that you're practicing, sometimes all at the same time. And I don't give this whole list of stuff to overwhelm you as much as to say what a rich opportunity. And to take advantage of that rich opportunity and to be aware of and reflect on all of the ways that you can be learning in this kind of environment, and then lean on the people around you to take all of that up and take advantage of it. And the last word I'll add is what a beautiful opportunity from my perspective of being able to just spend time to explore something that you really care about. That's not always the first thing top of mind when you're trying to get a job. A lot of times it's like, man, I gotta, pay my rent. But in this environment, you really get to take some time and follow a passion and follow something exciting. And always for me, I'm trying to think about how that lines up with how we're supporting our communities and growing and building on community health and community relationships. What an exciting thing to be able to do, and a privilege to be able to take advantage of.
I think that's a great recommendation for students. And I think building on that, something to keep in mind is that this is your journey, this is your experience, and you're pursuing your passions. And so what others are doing, even if what you find to engage in is completely different, that's totally fine. Just because your peer or someone else in your cohort is doing X, Y, and Z, that doesn't mean that you have to find the same experience. It's really thinking about what is right for you in terms of your interest areas, in terms of what you're hoping to gain, not only from your practicum or from other practice experiences that you do or the coursework that you take, but also how that fits into both your short-term and your long-term professional goals and where you see yourself going after the program. And where you go might end up being a completely different path from what your colleague might do. And so just keeping that in mind and keeping that as something that you're thinking about as you're choosing what to do and choosing what to engage in, and being able to think strategically about how this all fits into your own journey.
Yeah, and I'll just add one of my own tips or recommendations is document as much as you can. So do reflecting, write down what you've been doing. Don't it doesn't have to be any of this very in-depth kind of writing, but just kind of know what you've been doing, so that when you have to demonstrate it or show it to somebody else, you at least have a way that you have something you go back to, you haven't forgotten about something. So anyways, you can kind of keep track of the things that you're doing, and it might not seem like much at the time, but later on when you reflect back on it, you can find it can be something that's good and useful to share. So all right, so let me see if there's any other questions, or if anybody wants to come off chat. I'm going to stop sharing right here. So let's see. One question here is, should a student thank those they've worked with at their practicum in a formal way? What would be your advice on that?
I think that's a good idea. I mean, I think it always shows your appreciation to the organization for taking the time to work with you and work with them on all of the stuff that you've been spending the time to do. And I think it solidifies some of that relationship building that we were talking about earlier, in terms of ensuring that you're maintaining those connections going forward, because you never know, you might need a letter of recommendation in the future. You might end up meeting them. You might end up having to have that connection that you still want to maintain in the future, and that could help with that.
Well, as you were both saying before, it's a lot of times students will do their practicums, go work somewhere else, and then go back to their practicum place later on. So yeah. All right. Any other questions? Just thank you from Caroline. Well, I want to kind of echo what Caroline said. I want to say thank you to both Kalani and Tyler for joining us today. This was definitely a new topic that we haven't explored in career services before. So I'm very happy we had the conversation about it. I'm hoping that students would, better kind of see the bridge between the practicum experience and the job that they're doing. I just want to say thank you all for being here and joining us today.
Thank you
Thanks
for
for the
having
invite.
us.
No problem. Just as a reminder, everybody else, we have the last day of our Winter Intercession Career Development Academy. It's tomorrow. It's about interviewing. So keep an eye out for the schedule for tomorrow, what's kind of going on. And we look forward to seeing everybody again tomorrow. All right. Have a good one, everyone. Thanks.